Hello everyone, friends, surfers without money, and our beloved honey badgers, deviants. We welcome everyone to our broadcast. Today we have a very interesting person, a philosopher you all know well, Andriy Baumeister, with whom we will discuss a crucial topic of our time, the topic of contradiction and the confrontation between the USA and China, which shapes the logic of development, international relations in the field of a new and comprehensive security architecture, a new global architecture of the world system as we know it, and the future of humanity. We will discuss this through the prism of the concept of the Thucydides Trap.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Let me first briefly introduce the concept of what the Thucydides Trap is, because perhaps not all viewers are familiar with it. Before the broadcast, I worked with artificial intelligence, and both Claude and Grok provided a lot of interesting theses, such as, so what is the Thucydides Trap? Let me read it out. The Thucydides Trap is a concept in international relations that describes a situation where one rising power, an ascending power, threatens to displace or surpass the dominant power, causing fear and tension in the latter. This fear can lead to an escalation of conflicts up to the point of war, even if neither side initially sought it. The term was introduced by American political scientist Graham Allison, who drew on the works of the famous ancient Greek historian Thucydides, who described the Peloponnesian War, which lasted for a period of time from approximately 431 to 404 BC. Thucydides, describing the causes of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, argued that the key factor of the war was Sparta's fear of the growing power of Athens. He wrote the following: "The true cause of the war, though not openly stated, was that the growth of Athenian power and the fear it instilled in Sparta made the war inevitable." In 2017, in his book, he took this idea and applied it to modern international relations, primarily to the confrontation between the USA and China, and highlighted the key elements, Thucydides traps. First, the structure of tension, the inevitable tension that arises between a rising power and an established power. Second, fear and distrust. The dominant power experiences fear of losing influence, while the rising power seeks proper recognition of its ascending and growing strength. The escalation spiral, mutual distrust, leads to an arms buildup, the formation of alliances, and other actions perceived by the opposing side as threatening. Strategic dilemma: even if both sides do not wish for war, their actions, dictated by the logic of security, can lead to conflict. History offers numerous examples, from the Peloponnesian War to the First World War. And finally, our situation, when viewed through the lens of this concept, aligns almost perfectly with almost all of its points in a comprehensive manner. Insert the US and China into these theses, and you will indeed clearly see similar parallels. Do you think this escalation in the Thucydides trap, in the context of current global politics and historical patterns, inevitably lead to war between our two supergiants, as observed by many scholars and analysts? So far as we move forward, we see a direct and unavoidable collision, tightening of the screws and rising tensions.
I just want to clarify one thesis. Allison analyzed 16 cases starting from the 16th century. In just only 4 cases did it not lead to war. That is, he built his model specifically for US-China relations. The first publication, if I'm not mistaken, was in 2017. Yes. And so we have 16 cases, and only in 4 were they able to avoid it. That's the first thesis. And the second thesis, I would slightly adjust Allison's, because it's quite a one-dimensional model. Look, if we indeed truly consider the decline of Pax Britannica, which is the first half of the 20th century, we don't find a model similar to Allison's there. On the contrary, the United States twice acts as an ally of Britain in the First and Second World Wars. However, this is an alliance that forces Britain to gradually relinquish its positions, and by 1947 to 49, it is an empire that is essentially giving up all its positions, handing them over to the United States. So this is quite an interesting case. You can have allies that make you wish you had enemies instead of such allies. This is the second thesis. And the third thesis, let's look at this through the eyes of the Chinese. In the last 6 months to a year, I have been following the publications of Chinese political scientists and historians. And for them, indeed, the Western model or image of the West is a model of expansion. In fact, they actually play with two main metaphors. For them, the West, starting from the Roman Empire, is always about expansion, always aggression. In the eyes of China, the West is fundamentally aggressive. This is inherent, in fact, in the fundamental mentality and actions of the West. And China is harmony. And what they write, a significant part of Chinese political scientists, is about the conflict between aggression and harmony. And if we look at this Chinese model, look through Chinese eyes, we people of the West, see the situation a little differently. We can count how many times, for example, the United States has artificially created governments in different countries or invaded these countries after World War II. That's 57 times. Since 1945, approximately 57 times. We can count how many times China has done this. Naturally, indeed, there will be a very strong imbalance. Then we should talk about something else. If Allison is right, here are the details I propose for discussion. What are the signs of such a confrontation, and who is currently active in this conflict? And I conclude, why do I consider Allison's model to be leading? Because today we are in particular dealing with a rapidly emerging and complex conflict of multiple forces. It's not just two forces. It's not the United States and China. It will most likely be 4 to 5 major centers of power, likely. Therefore, it's indeed about how China and the United States will work with their allies in this confrontation. And for example, the tariff wars that Trump has initiated, I've been reading literature on this topic over the past week. Many believe that while Trump is pushing, for instance, his own natural allies like South Korea, the Philippines, Japan, speaking of the Asia-Pacific region, and the European Union to some extent into the arms of China, then a very strange model emerges. The hegemon or leader of the United States is now taking measures and actions in a manner that significantly weaken the Western bloc and strengthen China. And this is not very clear to me yet. This logic is completely unclear to me. Maybe, Yuri, you could try to clarify it. In the meantime, everything is leading to the fact that the USA, willingly or unwillingly, consciously or not, is weakening itself in the confrontation with China.
Let's try to figure it out. Firstly, it's undoubtedly and unmistakably, abundantly clear indeed. Just like with Thucydides, when the fear of the dominant power before the Peloponnesian War of Sparta was the guiding motive in relation to Athens, which were the rising hegemon in the Peloponnese undoubtedly and significantly led to war. Thucydides said so. After all, the Lacedaemonians, fearing the further strengthening of Athens's power, saw that most of Hellas was in the hands of the Athenians and were forced to start this war, and thus emphasizes the inevitability of conflict. In this situation, we see that Trump and the agenda he sets are also guided by fear. It is permeated with the fear that the former time of glory is behind, and it is necessary to bring it back. It is necessary to make maximum efforts to make America great again. And on the way to this, many adversities will have to be overcome, which Trump is not afraid of and presents to Americans as inevitable. When the stock market began to fall, he said that we need to endure, we will get through all of this, but these are necessary factors for overcoming our weakness. First point. The second point, I agree that there were indeed a greater number of players too, as in the First World War, but also just like in the Peloponnesian War, because there were Thebes, there were other cities, Corinth and others, entities that were forced to position themselves in this conflict between Sparta and Athens. Just as today, we see how the USA and China are forcing other players to position themselves in relation to their ongoing conflict. Do not rush to impose tariffs. Those who impose tariffs against us, like China, will suffer because our wrath will be boundless. In this way, they once again use fear as a motivation that shapes the corresponding behavior patterns, which they again expect from various countries, ranging from transitioning from being allies to enemies. As is the case with Iran, we now see how Trump similarly plays on the fear of a nuclear strike or simply missile attacks. And now there is even information that Khamenei, under pressure from his entourage, went to negotiations in Amalia. Therefore, in principle, the fact that the number of countries or the number of conflict participants is greater, is quite normal within the framework of Allison's concept. Just two key states often usually act as key organizers of alliance systems, which are necessary to achieve dominance in the conflict. Do not prevent the two dominant forces indeed from imposing the logic of this struggle, such as as soon as the opportunity for this expansion arose, it was carried out. For example, during the Tang dynasty, which was the 7th to 10th century AD, China reached the limits of its boundaries. In those conditions, these were the limits, and came to Central Asia, where there was a point recorded to which it reached in its westward expansion. And many who argue that China, a vast country with a rich history, does not seek expansion often overlook the fact that China is located on a geographical island, geographically isolated, surrounded by natural barriers such as mountains and seas, the Gobi Desert, the Himalayas, the ocean on all sides, Siberia to the north. Therefore, its limits of expansion were restricted by geographical factors, like any other empire. Today, modern transport and logistics are unable to allow these limits, these restrictions, to be overcome in various ways. We see how a global confrontation of interest between the USA and China is occurring. In the last 20 years, China has significantly strengthened its positions on various continents. In the previous era, it could never appear. Even when it had such an opportunity, as we remember in the 15th century, during those famous expeditions in the 1430s, half a century before Columbus's discovery, China, having practically reached Madagascar, sailed along the eastern coasts of Africa, passing through India. He, having a huge fleet that transported tens of thousands of people, and his ships had a displacement 10, 15 times greater than those small vessels and shells on which Columbus discovered the New World. He came to the realization that relocating to that particular place would ultimately be futile and serve no beneficial purpose, as there were no advantages or positive outcomes to be gained from such a move. There were indeed uninhabited territories if we consider Africa, There was nothing to gain from there, no one to trade with. Therefore, there was no point in developing this expansion. As we know, he burned the ships. Meanwhile, Europe took a different path. Expansion became the engine of its progress, its development, because it provided enormous colonial resources, which it used for its development, its modernization. Therefore, in our conditions, to summarize regarding the thesis you mentioned, one can say that the USA and China are truly in a global framework where it is necessary in order to fully consider a multitude of factors that thoroughly and comprehensively manifest in a wide array of the most diverse corners of the planet that appear and exist in various and different and unique ways. Trump raises the issue of Greenland, which is close to the USA and far from China, through the lens of the Chinese threat. Conversely, China is preparing an icebreaker fleet to trade with Europe as it fears American dominance over maritime communications and with Russia's help tries to overcome it and move forward. And we see how Russia maneuvers and tries to negotiate with the states so that as a joker in this strategic power potential confrontation, it tries to find its place in the sun and gain greater benefits from an alliance with another player or from playing with both. Both the Chinese and the Americans are guided by similar motives, which are well illuminated by Allison's concept.
I will add to that. I will add, yes, certainly, I agree with you, Yuri. I just want to clarify. Indeed, until the 19th century, China did not have expansionist ideas. They did not have texts where expansion was described. I often repeat this thesis, it is obvious. By the way, China considers Islam as part of Western civilization. And in their studies, Islam and its expansionist, aggressive spread is also considered part of the Western idea, which we view Islam slightly differently. So until the 19th century, indeed, China did not have this idea. And in some sense, it was infected by the West through trauma and through the assimilation of liberal ideas. And initially, the idea of trade became the foundation of expansion that China is now defending. In principle, oddly enough, it's also a banality. Today, China is a defender of the liberal economy, the free market, a defender of ideas that can even be called neoliberalism. But here, for me, there is a rather vulnerable spot for the states in Europe now in their relations with China. By the way, in 2024, in Changsha, a small city about 68 kilometers from the capital of Peru, China is building a very large port with investments of about $3.5 billion. And from this port to Shanghai is 17,000 kilometers. That is, through this port, an example of trade expansion. Through this port, China wants to strengthen its presence in South America. I'll provide some additional figures. The trade turnover between China and South America in 2000 was approximately only $12 billion. By 2022, it was already $482 billion. Therefore, China wants to be in both Europe and Africa, as we know, large investment projects in Africa, and as the figures show, relations with South America. Also, a very significant growth in economic relations and so on. China is aligning its military and geopolitical thinking with its trade. And here is simply what we do not know. In this entire structure, we do not fully comprehend how far China might go in any way in terms of hard power, not in trade, not in soft power, not in the economy, not in technology, but specifically in hard power. And at the same time, the West This is perhaps my rather controversial hypothesis, or maybe just a cliché, has been rapidly losing its soft power in recent years. When I used to argue as a pro-Western person with pro-Chinese enthusiasts, I used to tell them that a significant part of the world wants to live by the American model. But the Chinese order and the Chinese model are exclusive. They are only for China and possibly for its satellites. Today, I can no longer say that, because what we used to call Western values, or indeed Western soft power, is literally rapidly losing its value. And now it can no longer be said that, for example, Trump operates precisely with the value-based and meaningful images of the West. Between Europe and the United States, as we observed in February and early March, a serious, I would say, cultural war even emerged. When Europeans began increasingly accusing the United States of attacking Western values, such as freedom, democracy, and human rights, and betraying Western ideals, and whence, accordingly, in Munich accused Europe of Europeans betraying Western values and essentially creating a completely anti-Western project within the European Union over the past few years. This significantly weakens the presence of soft power in the Western world.
You absolutely and undoubtedly accurately observed that Joseph Nye is now shedding crocodile tears over the fact that his soft power postulate, as he formulated it in his time, has practically, in the past, shattered to pieces, and even in Stockholm it was in his syndicate. A simple quote. Yes, he says, those who have power find a pretext to seize what they can, while the weak are forced to submit. This is the realistic nature of international relations that Trump is now appealing to. So Trump says we have the right to Greenland because we have interest there, China can enter, and therefore because we are strong, it indeed justifies that we can own it. And he just simply cut straight to the point that
Trump is indeed close to Putin here, although these are two completely different projects, undoubtedly. And I am on Trump's side here, but this is the category of thinking in terms of interests and power. Yes, if a state has power and legitimate interests, then these legitimate interests should be considered and accepted by opponents. And in principle, his strategy of relations, now the rapprochement with Russia, is very similar to this logic. In the same way, I think, indeed, his relations with China will be built.
Here's another quote, which is similar to the previous one, but it reveals this logic of actions about the cyclical nature of power conflicts, that the strong do what their power allows them, and the weak agree with what they must accept. In an intense, prolonged, and comprehensive heated discussion and debates with one of the cities that were allied with Sparta, they quite literally quoted this about the Fenians and implied this meaning to make them agree to surrender. And they indeed in turn mentioned that there are rights to which they appealed, to which the Athenians replied that if you do not have the power to support your rights, you are dooming yourself to defeat. Melos, I remembered. Melos was a small Spartan colony and tried to maintain neutrality in the war. And so the Athenian delegation came to them and proposed, imagine Denmark in place of Melos.
Greenland, more like Greenland, it's a challenge to Greenland.
Yes, and here are the key fragments in this dialogue. The Athenians say to the Melians, we will not resort to long, unconvincing speeches. We know, and you know, that in human relations, rights only make sense when the opposing sides possess equal power. Otherwise, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. The millions respond, in our view, it is beneficial, as you chose benefit over rights, to preserve the universally recognized principle useful for all people. Everyone who finds themselves in danger should be treated fairly, given the opportunity to persuade you, even if their arguments are not entirely perfect. And it is also in your interest, because if you fall, you may face the harshest retribution and become an example for others. And the people of Melos further say, it would be the height of cowardice and timidity on our part not to use all means to save ourselves before becoming slaves. We believe that we will not be without the help of the gods, because we stand against you justly while you act unjustly. We also trust in the help of the Lacedaemonians, the Spartans, as they cannot betray their colonists. And here the Athenians respond with such ruthless realism. And by the way, it reminds us of our ideologies with Russia as well. As for the gods, we believe, and as for people, we are sure that by nature, by natural necessity, everyone always rules where they have power. We did not establish this law and were not the first to use it. We found it already existing and will leave it to be carried out forever after us. We only use it knowing that you and others, if you had the same power, would act the same way. And by the way, this dialogue ultimately ended tragically because the Melians lost this war with the Athenians because they rejected their ultimatum, and the city was destroyed. They executed all the adult men and turned the children into slaves. But this dialogue, it is indeed very relevant today, very relevant, because this is the incredibly important and current dialogue of Trump today with Europe, as well as the ongoing discussions of Putin with us and various other key global political figures and players. It is indeed, as you noted, a contradiction between the old settings of the liberal world, which the states formed after World War II, and where they set the rules of the game and set the pace of processes, such as now it has become unprofitable for them, and today China is appealing to this. I think you also correctly noted that the countries for which these rules are beneficial, because they have been in a state of conflict for years, centuries. I refer to our conversation with Sergei Korsunsky, the ambassador of Ukraine in Japan. Today is his last day. The day before yesterday, to be precise, he was just talking about how Asian countries are horrified by the situation today because they are accustomed to and benefit from the rules that were established after the Second World War, where the states guaranteed security and ensured the minimal enforceability of these rules. And accordingly today, when Trump demands from them either greater compliance or the necessity to relocate production, or like Europe to spend on security, which he also demands from South Korea, he thereby opens a Pandora's box for them, which frightens them greatly because they, like the Europeans, have for centuries been very harshly cutting each other down. When it is not entirely clear how these conflicts will be regulated, they understand that a beneficial peace for them is in any way a secondary concern. I would like to gently remind you that over the past 3 decades, which is 30 years, another golden billion people have gradually formed. This golden billion is primarily located in Asia. And of course, China, Southeast Asia, and Japan, along with South Korea, are beneficiaries. They have become beneficiaries of this liberal order. Moreover, many of these countries, primarily China, are autocratic in nature. And here we see an interesting twist where in the core of Western democracies in the USA, autocratic tendencies are strengthening because Peter Thiel and other guys saw in autocracies, in corporate approaches, an opportunity to solve existing problems in the USA and start a modernization that would allow them not to fall behind China, to surpass China, and establish new rules of the game, using such methods and effective strategies to preserve the USA. Here we have indeed such a paradox. China, indeed, we see such a reversal. Autocratic China has come to the necessity of protecting the liberal order formed after World War II, And democratic states have come to the necessity of creating a fundamentally new model, autocratic in its essence. This is Curtis Yarvin, who is kind of its spokesperson there, as far as we know. And in general, it turned out to be a mirror image to a certain degree, to some extent.
But a mirror image, even before COVID, in 2018, 2019, the headlines of major American political journals were shaping the coming geopolitical decades as a confrontation between liberalism and autocracy. Or, as we once discussed, the three centers: liberal, illiberal, and autocratic systems. After COVID, after the start of the full-scale Russian-Ukrainian war, the West begins to drift more. By the way, it started with COVID more towards the autocratic model, while continuing to speak about liberalism and democracy. Here's exactly where the weak spot is. If the conversation were truly open and honest, then it would be possible to evaluate the sides somehow. But as it is, Europe continues to talk about fundamental freedoms. And in this sense, China has undoubtedly gained a significant advantage over Europe and the States. I can articulate it now. China, on one hand, has the will to work, this drive, vitality, which Europe no longer has. That is, China has drive and Europe does not. But China also has a long history and an understanding of its 3,000-year tradition. If we talk about the 2,000-year great tradition of the empire, and this tradition does not exist in the United States, it turns out that China has two combined things that are individually absent in the States and in Europe. Europe lacks the will, the States lack a long tradition. And now China is trying to combine these two things. Of course, it faces colossal difficulties. We will not talk about them today. But for now, the situation looks in its favor. And this is precisely the price of the changes that have occurred before our eyes. In the last 10 years, if we were talking in the 90s when we were students, high schoolers, students, reading some books, reading newspapers, studying at universities and other forms of learning, we would have been told completely different things. About the liberal world, globalization, freedom of human rights, that the world is following one model and we practically have no conflicts. This is not the Thucydides trap, but the trap of a conflict-free world where the hegemon is the only one and it will be practically always in a small segment of its history. The West, primarily the United States, began to embrace a very strange idea that leadership will always exist. Those models of, let's say, soft power will always exist, and the world has no choice but to gradually adapt to the Americans. Interestingly enough, strangely enough, echoes of this idea are noticeable in Trump, just from a slightly different angle. Because America, first or foremost, in essence is primarily and predominantly an internal atmosphere. But it is impossible if America is not the world leader. Although in the current trade wars, experts say, the United States still has an advantage, but not for long.
But look, it seems to me that you have formulated an interesting thesis about two characteristics. China is tradition and will. The States have will without tradition. Europe has tradition without will. Essentially, it turns out that Russia has both will and tradition, unlike the Chinese in this regard.
Russia has will and tradition, but the tradition, as I pointed out from the very first days of the war, is still Western. And no matter what you say about the Slavophiles, about all these expansionist ideas of an inseparable civilization, it is still a version of the West, just like the original Chinese model. After World War II, it was initially Western, that is Marxist. And it's also interesting how the Soviet Union which essentially broke down and collapsed in a manner that was quite rapidly because the reformist ideas were they kind of outweighed the possibilities of a long path. The Soviet Union lasted 70 years after all. And if you look at China's development, it's very interesting how without pressure, without hysteria, without talks of decolonization, famines, about their cultural revolutions, because China's history after World War II is also not a bed of roses, to put it mildly. In general, everything is foolish.
And in general, the whole history of China, and it's not sugar.
Yes, the entire history. Of course, historians, but I'm talking about communist China. Yes, I'm talking about communist China now, which could have, I'm not saying whether it's good or bad. It could have repented, it could have atoned for its sins, it could have built its ideology in a completely different way, but it didn't do that. And we observe how unhurriedly, in such a direct and long way, the communist core of the ideology is being ground down and becomes a more traditional core. In fact, an important part of communism remains, but it is more of a facade because Xi came precisely to strengthen the side of communist ideology. But one way or another, if we read the discussions among Chinese political scientists, the departure from Marx and from Marxism as a Western project is quite clearly visible. And this tradition, which I referred to as the second element, is a chance and a prospect for China to strengthen. Marxism, in the end, will be melted down in this system sooner or later. In it, he will disappear, dissolve, or become some kind of auxiliary element. But indeed, the West does not have a similar historical reserve to radically change the worldview in such a significant way. The Soviet Union tried to do this in the late 80s and 90s and essentially collapsed. And now, returning to Thucydides, it seems to me that the United States is not capable of recognizing any other leadership in the world, and hence the overstrain of forces, which the United States may not be able to handle. I do not see, indeed, in the American mentality, the possibility of allowing equal partners in geopolitics. And what Trump is indeed doing now will somehow result in some kind of attempt. There is essentially a fork in the road. There were very interesting debates between Mearsheimer and Sachs. And Mearsheimer said that a war with China or a conflict with China is inevitable. This is a hardline stance. Therefore, Russia is needed by the United States. And Sachs argued with Mearsheimer here, saying that a conflict between America and China is not necessary. It is possible to build geopolitical or geostrategic relations in such a way as to avoid this conflict. And today we are witnessing, as it were, standing at these crossroads. A lot depends on Trump, on his team. Which road will they take exactly? The road described by Mearsheimer, tightening anti-China policy, starting with trade wars, economic wars, which could escalate into a hot war. And then the United States will need partners again, and it is unclear how Russia will behave. Or will the United States take the path, so to speak, with Sachs? They will seek opportunities for interaction with China, but that means to stop being Americans a little. This is what I want to clearly emphasize. There must be a revolution in the American mindset. When Americans say, yes, there is another figure or power in the world equal to us, and we will engage in dialogue on equal terms. I do not yet see such capabilities in America. I still see the old policy of pressure, coercion, sometimes blackmail, sometimes military pressure or economic pressure.
The situation after World War II clearly demonstrates that the states were already operating within such a geopolitical model where there was a junior partner, often seen in various international alliances and agreements. The Soviet Union controlled approximately about 30% of countries, in total, besides the NATO countries in Europe during the Cold War era, in the geopolitical landscape. There were also satellites in Asia, in Africa, and approximately 30% found themselves in its sphere of influence. And this system was in principle mutually beneficial to the states and the Soviet Union because they used each other strategically. In this way, the states kept their allies in check, primarily Europe and the countries of East Asia. This allowed them to develop significantly as they served as outposts, so to speak, of the Western world, receiving both investments and access to the American market, like South Korea or Japan, which is even more important than the investments themselves. As a result, they managed to develop into what they have become. Therefore, in principle, the United States has, I think, a model where they understand the necessity of having a partner, at least a junior one. And hence all these talks about Chimerica, yes, we remember back in the 2000s. And I posted on my Facebook page a very interesting debate between Kissinger and the former US ambassador to the USSR in 1994, where it was indeed very interesting how Kissinger talked about not needing, for example, to deploy NATO troops in the territories of countries that were within the orbit, the influence of the Soviet Union, because the RSI will sooner or later start to return, and accordingly, it is necessary to build the logic of one's behavior based on that conflict, which might occur, and it is necessary to maintain positions to prevent this conflict. In this regard, he is quite, well, despite the fact that many in Ukraine do not like him, it must be acknowledged that he was at his best from the perspective of prognostics, from the perspective of understanding the basic. And returning to your thesis, I find it very interesting because it needs to be deepened regarding the presence of will and principles. It also needs to be expanded to include adding resources, because when you have will, tradition plus resources, the situation starts to take on different shades. For example, take the USA. There is will, there are resources, but there is no tradition. Problems, meaning it's necessary to work on tradition. In China, there is will, there is tradition, there are resources, but not in all areas. For example, in rare earths, they are leading overall and have created a monopoly situation. But in order to be a global power, they need access to all these markets in Africa, in Latin America, to obtain the necessary resources from there and to the markets of Europe and the States to sell high-tech goods, which they or the various types of goods and products that they manufacture, create, or produce in their factories, workshops, or production facilities, ensuring quality and efficiency in every step of the process. That is, their position is somewhat balanced, but the problem is the lack of technologies. And this, by the way, could be another factor, so to speak, that allows
demography. We include both technology and demography because demography works against Russia as it does against Ukraine.
Yes, as it generally works against the West as well. Muslims, primarily Arab countries, although they are not only Arab because Indonesia and Pakistan are significant Muslim countries, as is Bangladesh. There is will, there is tradition, there are resources in a number of countries. In some countries, there are resources, in others, there are none. There are surplus energy resources, but there are insufficient food resources. Therefore, there are no technologies.
You also have demographics, again, in several Islamic countries. This is still a very strong demographic. Yes, starting with Turkey.
Yes, these are demographic donors.
Demographic donors, technological, and most importantly, if we speak in terms of Max Weber, I don't want to overwhelm our viewers with smart words today, but let's say the work ethic is something that is also evaporating in Europe. It's part of the will. Part of the will, because will is composed of different elements, let's say military, the ability to defend oneself, the ability to go to risks, the ability to work hard. Europe lacks this, but it exists in Asia. But I would adjust the bipolar world you mentioned, Yuri. Certainly, I agree, it was like two systems. But now this configuration has changed a bit because China, especially in recent years, this year in particular, has been revolutionary in terms of technology. And it can be said that China is not only not lagging behind the United States, but if you read Western experts on artificial intelligence, some of them undoubtedly believe that China may eventually surpass the United States in this race. And if we talk about China's commercial presence as an investor, as a trading power worldwide now, plus technology, plus potential allies, because China is tying these forces to itself, binding these countries to itself, this will strengthen China in the next 10, 15 years. And one more remark. If back then there were still two powers, but then it was asleep in the sense of dormant, China, India, and the Islamic world, such as. Today, even China and India are indeed also claiming a fairly strong role. Therefore, in the confrontation of two powers today, there is quite a shift. India is trying to play its role. Islamic countries are trying to play their role in diplomacy, in the economy, and even in soft power, in terms of ideas. Islam is attractive to many, as strange as it may sound to some of our viewers. So this world is a bit more complex, I would say significantly more complex, than the world from 1945 to 1991. Back then, there were only two powerful forces, and everything revolved around them. In fact, everyone else was a satellite. There were indeed two such suns around which other planets revolved. Now, there are several such suns emerging, and therefore, it is harder to predict. And the relationships between them are being built differently. For example, the relationships between India, China, and India with the United States. Or, for example, Russia and China, Russia and India, and now Russia and the United States. The same goes for the European Union. That's what I saw. The idea of the risking, which Ursula von der Leyen announced in 2023, at the beginning of 2024, seems to be vanishing. Europeans are now frantically searching for markets, and this is their vulnerable spot. This will once again impact their capabilities and resources, as you say, because trade wars hit Germany as a major industrial nation, but partly France as well. Even if we talk about wine, cognac, and other important export products, such as, for instance, and so on, in other words, the world is more complex, and any analyst has to keep many elements in mind at once. I compare it simply to juggling two balls, but this is the art of juggling 5 or 7 swords. The brain works differently. It's quite a complex system.
This is a fundamentally different situation than anything that has ever existed in human history, that it is truly necessary to have the absolutely comprehensive and complete global picture in mind in order to protect even your regional interests. Therefore, in this, I believe, lies the key to understanding the crisis in US foreign policy today. That is, when Trump says that the times of McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, sort of this bygone era, which kind of shows how one can behave in order to feel good, then, in fact, there is already an illusion of delusion, because back then it was a multipolar world, but a world in which Asia was still absent as a player, essentially, because China was indeed
Add that Europe was practically living by exploiting Africa.
Yes.
Yes, in that world, even after 1945, the so-called decolonization, you have Francophone Africa essentially as a resource for France, part of the African countries, a resource for the British Empire, if we talk about the first half of the 20th century. That is, the functions of various centers of power are changing. Africa itself is claiming to be a power. And just yesterday, Africa was merely a resource appendage of Europe. And from there, it naturally strengthened Europe. And Europe had no problems in large territories of African states, controlling their leaders, bribing or removing them. Now, the policy of the United States, the policy of pressure, is not working. The latest milestones of this were Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, perhaps we should also add our country, Ukraine, to this. And now such a rather harsh policy has slightly lost. Now it is necessary to build completely different relationships. And I repeat my thesis once again. Is America capable of this? That's the question. That's why we are watching Trump so closely. So far, it hasn't been possible to establish relations with Europe.
Yes, look, the US policy after World War II was global, and it had another important advantage, which today this return to such a harsh realism in the format of Trump has led to the loss of this important quality. That is, in fact, the US had a significant advantage, the only advantage in the world besides the Soviet Union. An ideological idea is a concept rooted in specific beliefs or principles. It shapes how people perceive and interact with the world. For example, political ideologies like liberalism or conservatism influence societal norms and policies. When Trump started demanding various forms of rent from different countries, including Ukraine, there was a statement from the Prime Minister of Indonesia who said the following: "For decades, the United States was an ideological beacon for us because they said that we are a city on a hill to which anyone can come if they have the appropriate set of characteristics. And now it seems we observe that they are solely focused on rent. Nothing else concerns them." Essentially, for countries like Indonesia, Ukraine, and numerous others, indeed the choice is about which rent-demanding party is more beneficial to work with, and whether it's beneficial at all, because perhaps it is possible to operate without rent, as many countries have already realized. And this is the key crisis in American foreign policy today.
Yuri, note that the geopolitical vector of Ukraine, which has narrowed and become as elementary as possible since 2005, we as Eurocentrists and pro-Western people still understand that Ukraine was moving in this direction quite rigidly and without creating its allies elsewhere. But this was indeed the main factor in the appeal of the Ukrainian elites to the citizens. We are following the path of values. Why is our path towards Europe? Because that's where the symbolic system begins, these values and so on. It turns out that countries like Ukraine are indeed disoriented. Well, Europe continues to play this game, but it's clear that they will behave more and more cynically. And by the way, there's a book that was published just a month ago, If Russia Wins, where Bundeswehr professor Carlo Massala developed a scenario for 2028. How the United States, Russia, and Europe will behave in 2028. It's interesting how he builds this scenario based on the available data. In fact, it's a very scenario-driven book. So Ukrainian foreign policy is disoriented at the moment. And if many were enticed by, I don't know, the vocabulary of values, now that vocabulary of values is gone. And if it's about calculation, rent, mutual benefit, then, excuse me, why not Asia? Why, even forgive me, why not Russia? Some elites might say, who will be representatives here, let's say, in parts of Ukraine? In other words, it's harder for Ukrainian elites to build their future when this part of soft power, which was attractive to us in the late 80s and early 90s, collapses. I say to us because the West wasn't attractive to everyone, let's say.
And now look.
For me, it was undoubtedly attractive.
And now this extremely important point, which is crucial and cannot be overlooked, speaks about, as it delves into the core essence of the matter at hand, as it were, these global and regional processes. That is, you should have a natural curiosity which has always been somewhat neglected or excluded here indeed towards the most diverse countries and peoples, even marginal ones, because even in the margins you can find a source of future strength, see or find a resource. And in this regard, Ukraine, which became too enamored with the European Union and the West as a whole, overlooked the processes and the intricate details that have gradually and inevitably led us to where we are now, shaping our current situation. I wrote back in 1922 that to some extent, Ukraine indeed found itself in a circumstance where it was, in fact, more Western than the West itself at the current moment, which had become bloated.
It was a kind of romanticism in Westernization.
Ukraine believed in the ideals of the West so much that it was ready to invest its vital energy from hundreds of thousands of people in the life of the country as a whole, several tens of millions of people, to become part of the West because it seemed valuable, despite the fact that, let's call things by their names, the Ukrainian elites used this illusion, optical deception, as a screen for governing the country.
And the West used this aspiration of Ukraine as a resource for control and to not promise anything in reality.
That's right. I called it in a harsh, crude form. I won't name it. 3 fundamental deceptions that have surrounded Ukraine over the past 3 decades. The first fundamental deception is the West's deception regarding Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, and to a lesser extent, the European Union, but primarily NATO. When in the West, everyone understood that due to the positions of Germany, even the states themselves, Ukraine would not be there, as they considered it a buffer. Initially, even this logic of Kissinger, which I spoke about there 30 minutes earlier, just testifies that they were looking at this territory, the territory of the Central Asian countries. This influence expands and contracts like lungs, and they proceeded from the assumption that this influence, like lungs, contracts and expands, and they assume that the question of clash, which, by the way, Continental wrote about sometime in 1994, I believe in the early 90s. Yes, the clash of civilizations. They understood all of this quite clearly and conceptually justified it. So the first deception would be like this. The second deception was from Russia, which, understanding exactly the same thing, knowing that Ukraine would not become a NATO member, used this fake. It understood Ukraine would not join NATO and actively worked from the early 2000s with European elites when resources became available simply by bribing them. In some cases, intellectuals, in others, politicians, and sometimes buying businesses worth hundreds of billions. And collectively, having a clear understanding that it has a blocking stake, either through Orban or through the French or through the Germans. In short, it has a set of tools that allow it to block any movement of Ukraine towards NATO at the very least. And therefore, Russia understood this perfectly well, but it used this NATO facade as a decoy to justify its claims as the right of the strong in a purely Thucydidean manner, to attempt to enter here by force because I have the right under the pretext that NATO will come here and threaten Russia. We saw how NATO entered Sweden and Finland, and nothing of the sort happened. So it was a deception.
You formulated the second deception, I'll add to it. It turns out that from both sides, the idea of buffering Ukraine was indeed presented to us. The West viewed Ukraine as a buffer, but filled it with promises of Westernization.
Yes.
And Russia viewed Ukraine as a buffer, using this NATO bogeyman. And now Russia is directly using the idea of buffering by severing our territories from our state in a strategic move. In principle, it's like 2 opposing movements from the West and the East, and Ukraine has found itself trapped here between 2 buffering projects.
Furthermore, moreover, this was thoroughly documented at the level of the relevant agreements in the Budapest Memorandum. The Budapest Memorandum is the documentation of Ukraine's buffer status, because both Russia and the United States were addressing the issue of how to disarm Ukraine in such a manner that each side could achieve its key objectives. Russia needed to disarm Ukraine in order to try to reclaim it in the future, the states, understanding that Ukraine might be returned to Russia in the future, attempted to disarm Ukraine to such an extent that Ukraine would not significantly strengthen Russia sharply in case it becomes part of Russia again. That was the strategic logic of the states. They understood this from the very beginning. In 1991, from October 1991, George Bush Sr. was in fact negotiating with Shushkevich, Kravchuk, and Yeltsin, and the issue of recognizing Ukraine was raised, as well as the recognition of other independent states, but primarily Ukraine, because by December 1st, 1991, there was already a referendum scheduled, and everyone understood that it would trigger a chain of sovereignties. So indeed, George Bush Sr. Raised the fundamental issue of nuclear disarmament there. In Budapest, there was a record of these negotiations, of this position. Ukraine went through a series of negotiations under intense pressure from the very beginning, and I talked about this on air, I hope just before the war. This was my broadcast. And there, as someone who participated in the development of Budapest, he was just talking about how intense the pressure was from both the Russians and the Americans, and even more so. To a greater extent, the Americans than the Russians. Therefore, you are absolutely right in noting that both sides understood the status and were engaged within this status in a struggle to secure the best positions for themselves in order to better realize their interests. And finally, the third deception is the deception by our national elites, who use the topic of Euro integration and joining NATO as a facade to simply manage these, to have control over assets, to manage the country, to the maximum extent of delay, allowing the penetration of some external forces, transnational corporations, in order to once again manage these assets.
Plus nationalism, yes, plus nationalism for certain circles.
It was a form of governance. In reality, it was in essence an instrument, a tool for managing the masses. Nothing more, just a bit more. For those players who publicly professed, like Poroshenko began to profess the postulates in the second half of his term, Petro Alexievich. We understand perfectly well, and we saw it, that he really didn't care about any of it. In other words, it was just a form, a tool for managing the masses, nothing more. And as soon as they found themselves somewhere on the sidelines, lost power, then in fact, nothing fundamentally different happened in their lives than before. Therefore, this situation today, returning to the big framework we said at the beginning, specifically and precisely requires rising above and ultimately crawling out of the shell of one's stereotypes in order to one's perceptions of the world, because not showing interest in the world, not studying the world at the level of simple curiosity, curiosity as a driver of progress and understanding. If there is no curiosity, we are doomed, because without the ability to understand the world in its various manifestations, it is impossible to hold any serious position in
the world. I will definitely slightly reinforce your thesis, but I will return to your theory of the three deceptions. This is very important. We talked about the counter-buffering of Ukraine from the West and the East. Let me introduce another term, demilitarization of Ukraine. What frightens Ukrainians today in potential and real negotiations with Russia, what the West did with Ukraine, starting from the 1990s to approximately the 2010s of the 21st century. In fact, the West began the demilitarization of Ukraine. You mentioned Bush, as you said. Let's recall the pressure on Ukraine during Kuchma's time. There was the scandal with the Kolchuga radar systems. Yes, and the pressure on our military-industrial complex. What happened to the army under Yushchenko? It's an interesting process. It's just somewhat in the shadows. And we sometimes mention it in discussions or when we bring it up in some posts. But if you look at it in numbers and ideologically, then in principle, since 1991, we have been observing the process of Ukraine's demilitarization and the reduction of its military potential. And when the United States needed to strengthen Ukraine, and it was already about, during the first term of Trump, it was extremely challenging to accomplish this task quickly. And when the large-scale war began, indeed, the West simply buckled. Because restructuring the partnership with Ukraine on a military basis, I'm not a military expert, but I think it's noticeable even to all observers, did not succeed. You can't restructure relationships in 2 or 3 years. And simply the pace became insufficient. There were military supplies, support, and so on and so forth. Therefore, once again, demilitarization started a long time ago. And it wasn't Russia who began it. As for the curiosity,
it was started by Russia with the USA, actually. Russia started with the USA at the moment when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the USA turned a blind eye to Ukraine selling a huge amount of weapons somewhere in Africa and elsewhere. Somewhere. Think about it. Remember that movie where Nicolas Cage plays, I forgot its name, Lord of War or whatever it's called, where this process is shown? Ask yourself this question. The film provides a detailed and comprehensive account, clearly illustrating that the American authorities were fully cognizant of the intricate logistics involved in the transportation of the weapons. They had precise knowledge of the routes being utilized for the movement of these arms, the specific destinations to which they were being dispatched, and the exact quantities being transported. This awareness was not just superficial, but was backed by substantial intelligence and surveillance efforts, ensuring that every aspect of the operation was meticulously monitored and documented. Why? Because it served the interests, it served this basic interest from the perspective of demilitarizing Ukraine. And it also served Russian interest because they understood that after some cycle, they would try to bring Ukraine back into their sphere of influence. And in this logic of demilitarization, both sides playing in the power field were interested. Europe was not playing in the power field at that time. Today, the situation is different.
But this contradicts the idea of buffering. You see, these two complex words, they actually don't quite align. And the demilitarization by the states and Russia directed towards Ukraine does not align with the idea of a buffer zone, which should still be a deterrent factor. If it is significantly diminished to some extent, below the required level, it will cease to be a buffer, it will just become a thoroughfare. These two ideas do not combine.
Look. Today there is indeed another fundamental element that has emerged as a result of the large-scale war and Russia's invasion. Today, essentially speaking, Trump and Putin can agree, in essence, on such a demilitarization of Ukraine and are most likely agreeing in their discussions. At this moment, negotiations are ongoing, as we know, constantly. And for Trump, within his Realpolitik logic, this can be quite acceptable because he is trading with Putin on other more important matters, like the Arctic, the Middle East, and most importantly, China, which is a topic that interests him. Therefore, for the states, in principle, within this context of Trump, it is a desirable topic. Where a deal on minerals is just an attempt to obtain something valuable, as they say, even from a mangy sheep, to get something more, to extract as much as possible from this, in any way possible, situation. I was just giving an example today. We had a broadcast before this, where I gave an example from a book about US foreign policy in the Far East during the Russo-Japanese War and so on, 1904 or 1905. And there I gave an example. I won't repeat it. Watch the broadcast. I quoted how in 1844 the states established the first unequal treaty with China with exactly the same wording, in exactly the same forms as this mineral deal. Trump's deal with Ukraine, which is being pushed through, it's just like a carbon copy. So there is a fundamentally different situation if we compare it to the significantly early 1990s. Europe has indeed gained a motive for the ongoing militarization of Ukraine due to the significant challenge it faces. It is being pushed to become a subject, more militarized, to awaken the will, which in combination with the tradition of technology and the resource base it has, in essence, the principle has the potential to return it to a position and status of a player that needs to be taken seriously. I introduce another very important concept. In modern world politics, when we carefully analyze it, it is necessary to understand the balance of power and dynamics in triangles. There is a power triangle, China, USA, Russia. There is a major economic triangle, USA, Europe, and China. They influence the global economy. In each of the triangles, there is a joker. In the first power triangle, the joker is Russia, because depending on its alignment, the positions of either one or the other player are significantly strengthened. In the second economic triangle, the joker is Europe, because if it aligns with the USA or China, it forms an alliance that accounts for about 40% of the world's GDP, which is almost half. It is behind these two players within this triangle. And accordingly, for the states in this situation, not only is the position of the joker in the power triangle important, but they are starting to realize this now, or perhaps they realized it from the beginning, but also the position of Europe, because Europe has enough leverage to disrupt this big game of the states in their confrontation with China. Notice how the Europeans played with great skill the tariff strike against the Americans the day before yesterday. They specifically targeted the businesses of Republicans who advocated for raising tariffs. They particularly targeted, in particular, Johnson's district, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. They export soybeans to the European market from there, and they immediately demonstrated that their damage would not be as total as the Americans try to spread butter over the entire global sandwich, but that it would indeed be selective but very sensitive, because they want to maintain connecting relationships with those they can talk to. For example, with democratic businesses or with some part of the Republicans who, as we know, are also not homogeneous. And it seems to me that this is another important element in understanding this sort of Thucydides' dilemma, or rather a series of dilemmas faced by both the USA, China, Europe, and others.
Yes, indeed, Europe will naturally need, yes, in Masala's book, when he outlines the scenario, he writes in detail about what you just mentioned. Specifically, Europe needs to regain its will. Europe must arm itself, develop its potential, both technological and military, and support Ukraine in this regard. But on the other hand, we do not see opportunities for this in the long term. And it turns out that for Europe to play such a role, it must at least partially move closer to Russia. I mean, in terms of energy resources or partially lifting sanctions. It results in a paradox like, with the United States and Europe, the Americans have now started this campaign of rapprochement with Russia. I don't know how this will end. In general, these are the most unfavorable times for analysts because they go out to analyze and the next day everything has changed. For example, Trump took and suspended all his tariff decisions on Wednesday. What will happen tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, no one knows. But Europe needs to fortify with some additional other force. China, well, yes, trade with China is important for Germany and a number of other countries. But Europe also needs energy resources as well. Europe needs energy. For its will, there must be energy and resources. And if the conflict with America, let's paint such pictures, deepens, Europe will feel that it needs to build up through some other center of power. Although I don't really want to believe in such a scenario, I would rather believe that Europe and the United States will find common ground through mutual accusations, conflicts. But in a year or two, I want to believe in this. And the logic is that they still have a better chance of finding a common language with each other.
In the context of our conversation, I will show the strategic logic and elaborate on it. I will continue your thought. In fact, indeed, the United States and European countries will play through fear and the game with Russia, using Russia as a trigger of fear and trying to attract Russia with the weakness of Central Eastern Europe in their strategies. To scare the wealthier Western Europe and thus use the motivations of both Russia and the Europeans, primarily the West, to strengthen their positions in the contradictory struggle in collaboration with China. As I said, I mentioned Sima Qian and the historical records at the beginning. And there, just like in Thucydides, as you can see, there are many instructive examples demonstrating how this strategy works. That Sima Qian wrote almost at the same time as Thucydides, about 2 centuries later Thucydides, but he described the Warring States period which took place, which was almost at the same time, even at the same time as the Peloponnesian War. So, for example, how is the logic described regarding what Trump will do with Europe? The conversation of the Qin ruler with Zhang Yi. Qin Huiwang asked Zhang Yi how Qin could conquer the world. Zhang Yi replied, "If you want to conquer the world, you must first break the alliance of states, in our case, the EU. To break this alliance, you must first subdue the state of Chu, in our case, Germany, and show generosity to more distant states, in this case, such as countries like Poland, and severity to those nearby, in this case, some Western countries, such as Denmark, which are closer, Denmark for the states, which have a special nature of relations. This way, you divide them, use force where it is advantageous, and refrain where it is not." This is just one example. Another example of a strategy for eliminating rivals, such as in the business world or in competitive markets. Shang Yang said, "When the strong attack the weak, it is like a wolf chasing a flock of sheep. Why wait if we can strike right now today?" Within the 6 states, there is so much talk about alliances and counter-alliances, about vertical and horizontal alliances. But time works against them. The state of Qin should use its strength to conquer them one by one. This is the logic that both Trump and Putin play with, in fact, only pursuing their goals situated at opposite ends of Europe. That's the way the cookie crumbles.
Well, we've come full circle, essentially. I think we've outlined several topics for our viewers to consider. I will conclude your thesis by supporting it, that even when speaking at Ukrainian business clubs, starting from 2016-2017, I called it not curiosity, but a broader picture of the world. Most Ukrainians, even members of the elite, are not interested in what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Pakistan or Peru, or perhaps in some Venezuela. Our interests were focused only on the United States, occasionally on Brussels, and Moscow always occupied our minds. So we only had 3 points of focus. The politicians who come to power, I hope, in the coming years should drastically change the outlook of Ukrainians and understand that a broader corridor to strengthen their position is sometimes playing on the different feelings and emotions of our partners. And for us, at the start of the large-scale invasion, there was no one to play our cards with. We tied ourselves so closely to the West that we didn't have any additional trump cards. Now, this situation needs to be corrected. I don't know if it's too late. That's another question. But at least it's simply a necessity in the coming years for Ukrainian politics, and in general, for the existence of Ukraine as a state.
Thank you very much for the conversation. In any case, it is indeed one of those conversations that allows us to truly conceptualize the picture of the world and beyond. I think that our connections, tradition, will, demography, and everything else can be developed into a series of constructs that allow for a better description of the world. Facts, figures, diagrams, graphics to enhance. I think that we can develop this further. Perhaps we will invite someone else, like Datsuk himself, who will be watching this broadcast closely. I will tell him to watch it, and many of our other intellectuals who closely follow such discussions. Because it seems to me that a number of things mentioned here, especially if developed further, will be of interest to the West, because we can explain the logic of the crisis, just as well as their analysts, to clearly show the ways out and the logic of movement.
And to connect this with practices, what we talked about is directly related to what we will be doing in the coming years.
100%. That's why we achieved great synergy, and I am grateful to you for that. I can give you the video, put it on your channel. I think your viewers will find it interesting too.
Yes, to me right then. Thank you for the invitation. I hope we will continue periodically, or rather regularly.
I think maybe you have already done it. If you haven't, then do a review of this German book. I think it's very interesting, this professor's work.
No, I haven't done it. Interestingly, at the end of the conversation, it describes how Russia will capture Narva and the Estonian island of Hiiumaa. It even specifies the exact date, March 23rd, 2028. It describes how Russia's supporters will act in Narva, what will happen on the Estonian island, and how the Russian president will perform. Interestingly, the Russian president is supposed to be new. According to the scenario, Masala even invented a name and surname for him, Oleg Obmanchikov. Putin will cede power. Oleg Obmanchikov is supposed to be 47 years old. He comes from a financial background. He suits everyone. He received his financial education in London. And Putin will remain in the shadows, but as the main force, Oleg Omanchikov will be the president of this new union of lands. An interesting scenario, you know.
It reminds me of several points from our last conversation with Piotr Kulpa, our Polish expert who has lived in Ukraine for a long time, who discussed this scenario through the prism of the interests of Poland and Ukraine, and specifically mentioned that Putin might play such a game in a strategic manner, pursuing his own goals, in his pursuit of power. And until we meet again, I'll send you a message. I'll give you the video. Now, friends, by the way, I almost forgot, please support the fundraiser for 150,000 Deutsche Hryvnias. I've provided the link in the description. I'll also share it on my Telegram. This is for our fighter, for whom we were collecting for his unit, the 47th Brigade. We have collected for vehicles multiple times as they have been destroyed repeatedly, and then we gathered for new ones. But this is a fighter who has been through fire and water, just hell, including in the Kursk region. He has a spinal injury and now needs treatment in a private clinic because the state's machinery is, as always, slow, and you know how it operates. That's why he reached out to me, and I think we can help him. It's only 150,000 hryvnias. Let's support him. This is Serhiy Mikhalchuk. I will post all the details in detail, including a comprehensive and thorough description of the current situation, as well as a high-resolution image of the spine on the platform Telegram. He is scheduled for surgery on Monday, so let's help him, because this is a person who literally gives us the opportunity to discuss all these things by literally sacrificing his health on the altar of our future, his health for the sake of homeland, Ukraine. Therefore, I ask you to support this fundraising. Just our, I think, Ukrainian Vova of both Vazak. That's all. Indeed, goodbye.